17104.com. This is Zanetta Wingfield, and you're listening to The Voice 17104.com. The Voice 17104.com. Welcome to Did You Know? Podcast.
Welcome, my brothers and sisters, to the Richard James Show on 17104, The Voice. Troubles, heartaches, and tears will one day soon be over. There'll be no more trials and tribulations, tear-stained eyes and mournful cries will one day soon be over. And we'll shout hallelujah by and by, and we will reach the gates of the city, surely, surely open wide. And in the name of the 12 tribes of Israel, getting the saints to come on, walk inside. Greetings, my friends, and salutation. Welcome again to the Richard James Show. And again, we're going to try to lift up truth. A lot's been going on in my life. I've had a number of relatives that have passed on the glory, brothers and sisters. Jimmy Hopkins passed on. Edna Mae Razier Hopkins passed on. Jeanette Branch Hopkins passed on all within the last year and a half. And before that, we had none of the children in that family passed on. So my condolences. I was not able to attend all of the funerals. I'm not physically able to do what I used to do when I was a young man. But you have my love, you have my condolences, and we will keep on keeping up the King's Highway. And we also want to reach out to Senator Robert B. Casey Jr. for his beloved mother passed a couple of weeks ago. They had a massive funeral. I was not able to attend that, not able to get in long lines or climb stairs or do that kind of thing. But I reach out to Robert Casey with love and respect. His mother, Maggie, she was a wonderful woman. She was a brilliant woman. And she was very, very supportive of everything Casey was trying to do. Oh, and by the way, he's lifted up and announced his reelection. And we worked together for many, many, many years. And I'm hoping to support him in whatever way I can, because we need a man like Bob Casey Jr. In office. I don't know of anyone who's more honest, who speaks out the truth, and who stands for the truth. And he's not into a caste or class kind of thing. He loves people. I've had him at my home for fundraisers and at my business for fundraisers, trying to support someone who I strongly and highly believe in. And not only we work together, we share morals, we share values, we share principles. And I believe very, very highly in Bob Casey Jr. And I want to lift up again my concern about a young, or older man, I was going to say young man, but Abdul Shabazz. Abdul Shabazz is still incarcerated within the state of Delaware due to a act that occurred many years ago. Since 1975, he's been incarcerated, and he's gone before the parole board a couple of times. The last time, the parole board voted to have him released. And of course, the governor of the state has to sign off on it, and he hasn't. And I'm going to plead with him. This man is near the end of his journey. He's going blind, but he's done a lot of positive things while he was in prison. He's gotten his bachelor's degree, and he acted as a paralegal for other people. Uh, Always been someone who cared about people, and he took a wrong path, and he knows it. He admits it, and he's retraced his steps. He is the Abdul that I knew when we were friends and growing up, and marching and trying to bring about liberation and freedom in the city of Chester. Wonderful human being, great human being. And we'll say to the governor, I'm not sure why. Maybe you don't think it's politically correct, but I'm going to say to the governor, please release Abdul. He's not a menace to society. He's not a threat to society. As a matter of fact, he would bring some positivity to society. And Senator Kuhn, we could use your help too. You're a good man, Senator. You and I normally on the same side of most issues. I hope we're on the same side of this issue. Check his record. Check out what the parole board had found, and then please send him home. Send him home, please. Send him home. That would be a great thing. Okay, we have been featuring for a while the continent of Africa. Africa, the second largest continent geographically and population-wise in the world. Currently over 2 billion inhabitants, 54 nations. And have we made any progress in Africa? Yes, we have. 54 independent nations are in Africa. And yes, have they experienced growing pains? They have experienced growing pains. There's been coups, there's been civil wars, been rebellion, there's been famine, but there also has been progress. Guam and Kuma, whom some of our people don't like very well, but we love him. First brought about the independence of its nation, Ghana. Used to be called the Gold Coast. And set the foundation for the African Union. And the African Union brought together some very, very important nations. It is not complete, it's not total, but the African Union does exist. So there's some thinking, and there's a guy who we've featured a couple of times, and we're going to feature him today, Patrick L. Lumumba, PL Lumumba, and that is not Patrice Lumumba, who's the former prime minister of the Congo. This is Patrick L. Lumumba, who is an attorney with several law degrees. He's taught in Kenya, I think the University of Monrovia, if I'm correct, but he taught law, and he's really the most articulate spokesman for the continent of Africa that there is right now. That one can put words, thoughts, ideas, and programs together like P.L. Lumumba. He has his own foundation, and he wants people and leadership in Africa that care about their folks, that are not just enhancing their own pockets, not just trying to raise money for themselves, but trying to make sure that their people are taken care of. So no longer are we in the Stone Age when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to transportation, when it comes to other areas that we look at Africa, because Africans began to understand how to get things done. And they have created some alliances with some other nations that have been helpful. And that can be a blessing, and it can be a curse in disguise if you don't handle it correctly. But now they're doing some things. The inner structure of Africa, roads are being built, power lines, water system, things that are needed. Maybe not as fast as we like to see it done, but it is happening in Africa. I am blessed to have a son-in-law, a wonderful young man, Moy Chow, who is from the nation of Senegal, who's done a lot of wonderful things in Senegal and a lot of wonderful things right here in the good old USA. And my family lifts up Africa. All my family, we lift up the continent. What Lumumba has to say today. Okay.
How many of you here will not remember the structural adjustment programs in the 1980s? How many of you here will not remember the Millennium Development Goals? There were 8 when they came about. Now they have been renamed. Now they are Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 34 of them. How many of you here will not remember Africa Growth Opportunity Act? The House, the Parliament of the United States of America, sitting at the Capitol Hill in the United States of America, saying we open the space for African countries. And what are they opening space for? Textile. We will now, whether it is in Lesotho, whether it is in Nigeria or Nairobi, Kenya, our women and our young men are sewing jeans and other apparels which are taken to supermarkets in the United States of America. And once they have worn them and they are tired of them, they created another export opportunity of second-hand clothing. And second-hand clothing, that is why the textile industries in Kaduna in Nigeria died. That is why textile companies in Kenya, whether it was Rivertex, whether it was Kikomi, whether it was Mountex, they all died, because Europe was now telling us what we have consumed and rejected, you Africans must now consume. And when recently the Rwandese and the Ugandans said that we were going to stop the importation of second-hand clothing, they threatened us with sanctions. Africa is meant to treat us new, that which Europe and America has rejected. That is the Africa that you want me to talk about. So when we talk about this continent of Africa, there have been no shortage of attempts to help her and for her to help herself. I remember on the 6th day of March, 1997, in Accra, Ghana, the former president of Tanzania, Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere, speaking under the theme, the unity of Africa, said, among other things, that we have not come here to remind ourselves how important unity is. We know that African unity is significant. And he said, if Africa is to be a great continent and if Africa is to realize our potential, Africans must de-emphasize their Tanzanianness. Africans must de-emphasize their Ghanaianness, and they must emphasize their Africanness. And he went on to say, I'm not naive in appreciating that we have long been in our little corners, but I'm telling us that out there in the world, they only know us as Africans. And he reminded the audience that there are times when he has gone to Europe and his own colleagues in the leadership in certain parts of the world will ask him what is happening in Senegal while he himself is the president of Tanzania. So that is the Africa that we are talking about. So there have been many initiatives to make Africa great. How many of us will forget the new initiative for African development under NEPAD, signed in the year 2001 in Lusaka, Zambia, when Africans took the view once again that in order to grow, we must work together. There have been no shortage of initiatives to bring Africa together. And I remember in the very early days, in the 1960s and in the 1970s, the grand project as conceived by Kwame Nkrumah having failed to take off as it was designed to take off, many African countries took the view that the only way in which we could ultimately have the grand African agenda was to come up with regional development. So we came up with the East African Community, and indeed, I can remember so very vividly, because even in Africa, there were days when Africa worked in the early days. In the early days, many African countries were recording economic growth of anything between 6 and 7%. In the early days after independence, there were areas where Africa was growing in education. In the health, the indices had improved so that infant mortality and maternal mortality indices were positive. We could see that in agriculture, Africa was beginning to feed herself. Africa was adding value to her things. I remember in Nairobi, in public schools, young school children would receive textbooks and exercise books. I remember that classes had libraries. I remember that in those early days, the public transport systems worked. I remember in those days that our agricultural products were receiving the kind of prices that they ought to receive in the world market. I remember in those early days in countries such as Zambia, the kwacha was strong because the copper was being paid for rightly. I remember in those early days in countries such as this one where cocoa, and in the neighboring Cote d'Ivoire when cocoa was being transported and you are receiving the right price. I remember in those early days, diamond from Wadui in Shinyanga and diamond from Botswana and in Namibia were receiving the right price. There was a time in those early days when Africa was indeed moving in some direction. And I remember in East Africa when we had one common currency, when we had one airline, when we had one university and things were moving. In the education sector, I remember students coming from Kenya and traveling to Fura Bay in Freetown. I remember hearing universities such as the University of Education at Winneba. I remember the University of Legon. I remember the University of Nigeria at Nsukka. I remember the University of Maiduguri, and I remember the University of Makerere in Uganda and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania and many other universities. Africa was rising, but something happened. Something happened. Something happened. There are those who think that it was externally induced. They may be right. There are those who think that our leadership was also a contributory factor, and I think they are right. So that there is a sense in which we Africans are also co-authors of our own misfortune. We are co-authors in the sense that there is, and there have been opportunities to make us great. At the beginning of the address, the Vice Chancellor rightly remarked, the professor rightly remarked that in Africa there were countries that were doing better than South Korea. Kenya was doing better than South Korea. Kenya had a higher GDP than China. Ghana, the same. Tanzania, the same. Then somehow the Koreans went and left us. The Chinese during our lifetime have left us. The Singaporeans have left us. The Malaysians have left us. The Brazilians have left us. The Vietnamese after the war in 1975 have left us. Who is it? What is it that holds us back? What is it? Is it us? Is it some power? Are we children of a lesser God? What is it that holds us back? Why is it that Africa does not work? Why is it that I'm speaking to you now? Even what we call peace in many African countries is not peace, it's just silence. I've lamented for too long. Now I want to talk about what it is that we can do. But before I do that, let us look at our continent, at this continent called Africa. Our combined GDP, the 54 officially recognized countries, that is assuming that you don't ask the Moroccans about Sahrawi. Our GDP last year combined, the 54 of us combined, all of us, 1.4 billion of us, our goods and services put together is no more than 2 trillion United States dollars, and I'm being generous about this. And to give you a perspective, the state of California in the United States of America, with a population of slightly under 39 million, has a GDP last year of 3 trillion United States dollars. To give you a perspective, and my good friend, the Honorable Minister from Burundi is here, their GDP last year was no more than 2.3 billion United States dollars. That is exactly the same amount that the state of New York in New York collects in one day. In one day. That is the continent that we are talking about, my mother Africa. How are we going to make her work? I want you to look at her. Look at her in the Gambia. What does she produce? Groundnuts. That is assuming that the Chinese will not come out with plastic groundnuts soon. And I'm saying this to tell us we are relying on goods which can be taken out of the market. And tourism. How many people visit the Gambia in the name of tourism? If they are more than 1 million, then we celebrate and we bring out dancers. Meanwhile, the bazaar market in Istanbul receives 99 million visitors every year. What tourism are we talking about? Let us go to Senegal. What is she producing? How can we make her work? How can we make Mauritania work? How can we make Mali work? How can we make Chad work when almost 70% of it has dried out in the last few decades? Then you wonder why we have Boko Haram, why they are recruits for Boko Haram and ISIS and Daesh. Go to Sudan and South Sudan, countries that are endowed with natural resources. Go to the Democratic Republic of Congo, a paradox and an irony at once, the richest country on earth in terms of natural resources. But who will allow Congo to be at ease? Who will allow her Because in her state of confusion, she is a jungle from which you can hunt without consequence. So when one rebel group dies, another one is resuscitated. I know of no African country that makes weapons except South Africa. The others just make bullets. The Kenyans will make bullets. The Ugandans will make bullets, but they have no gun to use them, and they import the guns. And yet the conflicts that are alive and well in Africa are legion. As the Central African Republic, they are conflicts which are no longer covered in the newspapers or in the media of the forgotten conflicts of Africa. Burkina Faso. And yet the African Union says that by the year 2020, the guns will be silent in Africa. 2020 is 28 days away from today. The guns will not be silent. And I'm saying this because to make Africa work, the guns must be silent. Because if the guns are not silent, our farmers will not grow crops. If the guns are not silent, our women will not go to the markets. If the guns are not silent, our resources will not be channeled in the right direction. The guns must be silent. We want to make Africa work. Will she work? Can she work? Yes, she can. But what are the fundamentals that must make Africa work? Let me remind you, Africa remains attractive. Why is Africa so attractive? Throughout the ages, it has always been attractive. It was attractive to the Portuguese and the Spaniards, but I'm not going to say that. It was attractive to the Arabs, but I'm not going to say that. It was attractive to the Jews, but I will not say that. What I'm going to say that is attractive again, it is so attractive that every 2 years the Japanese call our leaders to Japan. That is how attractive Africa is. They call them to Japan in order to discuss how Japan is going to work with Africa for the benefit of Africa. I do not believe it. It must be for the benefit of Japan. It is so attractive that the Chinese leaders call Africans to Beijing every year. The 54 of them, they call them to Beijing. And they say this is how China is going to work for the benefit of Africa. I refuse to believe them. It must be that there is something that is being done for the benefit of Beijing. Because if I was Chinese, I would do that which is in my best interest, not in the best interest of Africans. It is so attractive that the Russians called our leaders only a few months ago in Sochi. And when they invite you to the best places. It is so interesting, so that the Russians can work with Africa for the benefit of Africa. That is how attractive Africa is. It is so attractive that the Germans also invited our leaders to Berlin. It is so attractive that even the Arabs are inviting them to Doha, and that is how attractive it is. Have you ever heard the Latin Americans being invited? No, I did not hear. Have you ever heard the Arabs being invited? No. It is only Africans who are invited. That is how attractive Africa is. Is it a bad thing? Depending on what you think. We can use it to our own advantage, or we can allow them to use it to their advantage. You know, when I look at Africa and I look at her in the continent, in the context of how attractive she is, another word comes to my mind called globalization. When we talk about globalization, you talk about globalization as if it were a new word. It is not. Africans were once globalized as a commodity in the slave market. We were sold everywhere in the world. That was globalization. That was globalization. Then we were globalized again through colonization. Then we were globalized again through neo-colonization. Now we are being globalized in the context of opening our markets. It is Mwalimu Julius Kambarage Nyerere who in one of his many enlightened moments said, when I hear the Europeans saying that we should open our markets in the name of globalization and they say that the rules are the same, I laugh, Mwalimu said. And he said, it is like a boxing match. The rules are the same. But you don't put a heavyweight boxer and a lightweight boxer and say the rules are the same. It is murder. Allow me to be melodramatic. You imagine the United States of America with a GDP of anything between 14 trillion and 15 trillion is now entering into a bilateral arrangement with Lesotho, whose GDP is 2 billion. And you say the rules are the same. It is a joke. It is murder. Because the revenue that is generated by the city of Los Angeles alone in one day is more than the GDP of Lesotho. So we are being told to open our markets, and when we opened our market, you saw what happened? Our textile industries died. The large textile industry that we knew about in Kaduna, in Nigeria, died. Our cotton industries died. Our sugarcane industries died. Our waters, even water nowadays, water. Dasani, Coca-Cola gives us water. You go to hotels in African countries, the water that we drink has the standardization, not this one. This is from UCC. But this is the exception rather than the rule. This is the exception. The rule is water. Dasani, sitting in Atlanta, Georgia, determining what water we take, we of the middle class. Making Africa work is my subject. What will it take? It will take our combined effort. But there must be an enlightenment of a totally different character. You know, when I think about Africa, and I think about her often, and I ask myself, Mother Africa, how will you be 100 years from today? And I remember the great Sudanese poet, Al-Faituri, writing about Africa. He says, oh, Mother Africa, how are you? Will you be great? You, Mother Africa, where your rebels have gained power and rebuilt, and they have destroyed what they rebuilt. Mother Africa, will you be great? You, Mother Africa, Faituri asks, you the home of great rivers, will your sons ever fish in your rivers? Faituri asks, you, Mother Africa, whose belly is laden with all things known as natural resources, will you ever give meaning to them? Faituri asks, oh, Mother Africa, are you waiting for Godot? Mother Africa, I believe that Africa can be made great again. But remember I said that Africa took the view that she could grow regionally. That is where I went on a tangent. Now I come back. So the East African community was there, South African development community was there. We had COMESA, we had IGAD, we have ECOWAS, we had Central African Organization, we had the Maghreb, we had the Sahelians. All these attempts have been made, and somehow Africa is still punching below her weight. Let us look at the different sectors so that we are better able to appreciate what Africa can be. And I believe that Africa can be great. I believe that Africa is capable of looking at our agriculture, because if a people cannot feed themselves, they cannot be at the dinner table of civilization. Today, Africa cannot feed herself. Here in Ghana, they love rice. They produce a little and import most. Here in Ghana, they love ketchup, but I suspect they import some. Here in Ghana, they love chicken. They produce some, but I suspect they import some. In Nigeria, I suspect they love meat, and I suspect they import some. They love rice. Here in Ghana, I know they produce cocoa and they love chocolate, but the chocolate they make, they don't like very much. They import chocolate from Switzerland. So until the day that we begin to like what we produce, so that we add value, I look forward to the day when the greatest chocolate making factories will be here in Ghana, and the next will be in Togo, and the next in Cote d'Ivoire. It can be done. Which calls into question what our universities of agriculture doing. Are they involved? Are they included in the agenda of making Africa gain? And I'm saying that history has demonstrated that when people decide to work in agriculture, they can actually do something about. I remember so very vividly in your own Malawi, when President Mbingu wa Mutharika took power, he took the view that he could improve agriculture in Malawi. He took the view that he could produce enough maize. He took the view that Malawians could do it, and you will agree with me, they did it. It was done in Malawi. Why can it not be done now? I remember so very vividly, those of you who are from Burkina Faso, in 1983, when Thomas Sankara took power, he took the view that the Burkinabe could feed themselves, and within 5 years, Burkina Faso could feed herself. It can be done. I know that right now, I remember so very vividly in Zimbabwe when President Mugabe took power, and even before then, during the first 5 years, Mugabe's government was capable of producing enough maize to be consumed in Zimbabwe and enough cotton to make clothes. Today, as I speak to you now, the Zimbabweans are under threat of starvation. What happened? It can be done in Zimbabwe, and I believe that it must be done if Africa is to work. Africa can work in agriculture. Africa can work in innovation. I'm very glad that in the last 1 year in Makerere, Uganda, they have come up with a solar-powered bus. Ugandans can do it. I'm very glad that in Nigeria, only last week they unveiled a car that is made out of hydrocarbons. Nigerians can do it. I'm glad that in Morocco now they have the largest solar plant in the world. It can be done. I'm glad that in my own Kenya they now have one of the largest wind farms which generates power. It can be done. I'm glad that during the president of Akufo-Addo, Ghanaians have now abandoned one of the words they used to have in their vocabulary called dumso. I'm glad. In other words, if you look very keenly, there are things that can be done. And I'm suggesting to us that in order to do these things, we must ask ourselves how it can be achieved. As I draw to the conclusion of my intervention, I now want to talk of the new threats. How can we make? A lot of writing has been done in the recent past about Africa. There are certain things that Africa must do, and there are certain things that Africa must not do. The belief that we can borrow money from multilateral institutions and become rich is misguided. Zambia's Dambisa Moyo, in a book, Dead Aid, tells us it cannot be done. That is the route not to take. The belief that we will follow a model that is conceived on our behalf by European universities is misguided. I want you to read the book written by a Korean called Ha Jun Chang, The Bad Samaritans, in which he argues that each country must find a model that suits our own circumstances. It can be done. I want also to remember a book which all of you must have read, written by my own Kenyan friend, Dr. Kalestas Juma, The New Harvest, in which he says that Africans must invent and innovate. I want you to read a book written by Olusegun Obasanjo and Greg Mills, among others, Making Africa Work. Africa can be made to work. But Africa will only be made to work when she is conscious of her current position. Which brings me to a question that we must now pose. What is the danger of other powers operating in Africa? Do they threaten our being? And I'm now talking about China. China is a very interesting country from which there's a lot of things to learn. But she's also a danger to the continent if we are not careful. What is there to learn from China? The thing to learn from China is that during our lifetime, the Chinese, through their ingenuity, have succeeded in lifting nearly 800 million people out of poverty. What did the Chinese do? Is there something that we can learn from them? I think there is. Those of you who have the advantage and the privilege of serving in government, ask yourself, what did the Chinese do that within our own lifetime they succeeded in doing that? And they are everywhere, the Chinese. They know what they want. I think the first thing that you must do, you must know what you want. You know, last year I was sitting and watching a Chinese news channel, and if you want to understand what others who are potentially your friends and enemies are doing, you must listen to their news. I was watching the CGTN, and I was listening to the 6,000 delegates in China sitting and thinking about China, how China will deal with Africa and the world 100 years from thence. The people who are there will not be alive. In many African countries, if you tell them to think about what will happen tomorrow, they say only God knows. No. I hold the view that when you are planning, you plan as if you will never die. And if you are prayerful, you pray as if you'll die the next minute. I'm suggesting that the Chinese have given us away. Today, the Chinese, and see how the Chinese are working with us. Which university in Africa worth its name does not have a Confucius Center? I do not know whether you have one here at UCC. Why do the Chinese have a Confucius Center? Because the mind is the standard of the man. Once you influence the mind, you can sit pretty because you can predict what the mind will do. How many of you who are the middle class today, in addition to asking your children to read French and German, are now asking and encouraging their children, go and learn Mandarin? How many of you? Confucius Center to work on your mind. On our mind. And then, how many countries in Africa don't you find a stadium built by Chinese? And if it is not a stadium, it is your state house. And if it is not the state house, it's the African headquarters. And if it is not the African headquarters, it's infrastructure, is the road or the railway. And if it is not the railway, it is 4 lorries. And if it is not those, in the next 10 years, out of every 10 phones used by you will be Chinese. If it is not Techno, it is Infinix. If it is not Infinix, it's Huawei. No African country produces a phone, none. It's only Rwanda that is beginning to assemble some. There is something to admire about the Chinese. But if we want to benefit from the Chinese, we must be strong. We must be weak. We must not be weak. We must negotiate continentally. The Koreans are also small but strong. But if we are not careful, and I'm saying this, if we are not careful, in the next 25 years, all of us will be speaking Mandarin. If we are not careful. If we are not careful. Because the Chinese here are not here for charity. The Chinese are here to do business. And in the world of business, it is a cruel world where throats are literally cut. I'm reading a small book written by a young Chinese girl called Arin Yuan-sun, The Next Factory of the World. And the young Chinese girl is saying exactly what I'm saying. He says that Africa can benefit from China. Africa can be the next factory of the world. But it's not just going to happen. Something must be done about it, which is what brings me to the last segment of my conversation, Africa Agenda 2063. I remember on that day in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, Nkosazana and Lamini Zuma, the then chairman of the Organization of the African Union, writing and reading an imaginary letter to Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah. I will not remember the words exactly, but I'll remember it in substance. And in substance, he will say, by the year 2063, we Africans, having recognized that we may have lost the last 50 years of our independence, will not lose the next 50 years of our independence. I'm adding a few things in order to make it relevant. But she was saying, in effect, the Osagyefo, in the year 2063, Africa will be different. There'll be an electric rail running from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to Dakar in Senegal. In the year 2063, Africa will be feeding herself, and the bread basket of Africa will be Zimbabwe in Southern Africa and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Africa will be making her own furniture, and we will do so in a sustainable manner with the equatorial forests of Congo being the source of our products. I will remember in those years to come, what you now see as the Sahara Desert will have been greened. Africa will be covered in forests. The Democratic Republic of Congo will become the equivalent of the Silicon Valley. There will be rare earth. Africa will use phones made by Africans. Africa will refine their own oil. Africa will use our own copper. Africa will have excess electricity. Africa will have the Inga Dam in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Africa will have built the Grand Renaissance Dam. And indeed, at that time, Sudan will not quarrel with Ethiopia, and Egypt will not quarrel with Ethiopia. They will be using these resources well. Africa will not be importing fish, tilapia from China. The fish will be produced in Lake Victoria, Lake Tanganyika, Lake Tana, and all these other places. That was the reason of Africa Agenda 2063. It was a dream. But is it not true that we must all dream? We must dream. The only thing that we must do once we have dreamt, we must wake up. The problem is sometimes we dream and we don't wake up. We must wake up and now begin to implement. Do I think that Africa woke up? I think Africa woke up. And that is how I understand the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. The Africa Continental Free Trade Area is a demonstration that beyond dreaming in a very amorphous manner, we now want to give form and character to our dream by operationalization so that we begin to bring down the tariff and non-tariff barriers, so that we are able to ensure that Africa will do things that will make Africa great. Intra-African trade will be 80%. And that is why it gladdens my heart that Accra, Ghana was chosen to be the secretariat of the ACTF. I look forward to the day when the protocols are now being made, that we shall begin to take advantage of innovation. You remember Africa lost out in the first industrial revolution. Africa lost out in the second industrial revolution. Africa has started gaining a little from the third industrial revolution. We are now in the fourth industrial revolution, where we are talking about artificial intelligence, we are talking about robotics, we are talking about the Internet of Things. We are saying that Africa must now find her pride of place in those areas so that Africa can be great in agriculture, Africa can be great in education, Africa can be great in value addition, Africa can be great in utilizing our fossil fuels so that young Africans will not cross the Mediterranean Sea. When I look at Africa, I think that she can be made to work. But the last thing that we must do is to ensure that we introduce hygiene in our politics. Because it all begins and ends with leadership. History has demonstrated, not once, not twice, but times without number, that when you have men and women who are good leaders and they know what they want, they can catapult their countries within a short time into the higher orbits of development. We must now begin to ask ourselves, how do we govern ourselves? How do we create a political environment where all these things can happen? I'm suggesting to us, without being arrogant, and speaking hopefully with the humility that will not sharpen the anger of leaders in this forum, but will open their eyes. When you are in a position of honor and privilege, remember that your duty is to serve. Those of you who are cabinet ministers, remember that you are not necessarily the best of men, but you've been favored to be in positions of honor and privilege. You are not necessarily the best of women. Because you have been honored and privileged, serve in humility. And the problem in Africa is that many African leaders suffer from what I call the Jehovah complex. The Jehovah complex is a belief by those in leadership that they have the monopoly of wisdom and they have the monopoly of knowledge. That is not the route. Africa will be great when her leaders begin to know that they have a duty to serve so that the future generation will be able to make Africa great again. Africa can be great. Africa will be great. Africa will be great in agriculture. Africa will be great in our industries. Africa will be great in our education. Africa will be great in all other things. But the last thing that Africans must do is to decolonize our minds. We must liberate ourselves from this misguided view that we cannot achieve. We can achieve, we have achieved, and going forward, working together, we will achieve. God bless.
Okay. That is the end of the speech. Patrick L. Lumumba. He speaks with clarity. He speaks with truth. He talks about Africa, but you can widen and include Africans that are throughout the world. There's over 20, 22 million Africans who live in the continental United States. There's 100 million Africans that live in Brazil. So there's Africans in Europe and in other countries. Somehow we need to come together and work together for the benefit of all people, and particularly our own people. This is a brilliant man. This is a man who thinks things through. And thank God he's still here on the planet presenting his information. It's very, very important. Let's keep it together. Well, we had an open house at Lebanon Valley Farmers Market last week. There were 3 days. It was Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. They produced more vendors there than has ever been the case. And such diversity. If you haven't been, you ought to give it a try. They had Aunt Hickory's fried fish, a very healthy fried fish and a very delicious fried fish. They have a seafood stand. They have a new African food stand. A young lady from Africa is selling African dishes. We continue to have my business, which is African Paradise, but we have multiple businesses. We have T or Taylor. I love me so much. That's the name of her stand, and she does it to death. She has some beautiful, beautiful pictures. She's an artist, and she makes portraits. She has all kinds of items. I think T and myself are the only two non-food stands that are at the market, but it's growing and it's producing some things that any and everybody can enjoy. We've got another shipment of djembes, African drums from Ghana that we're going to share with you. Again, I'm going to repeat. I'm really lifting up Abdul Shabazz. I understand he has some health problems, some health concerns. But I've had a chance to dialogue with this gentleman. Always has been brilliant, and also has a sense of morality, a sense of caring and sharing and dealing with people. Governor, Senator, Delaware, it would do our heart's good for you to release this gentleman. Give him an opportunity to spend the remaining portion of his life out doing things that are very positive, as he has always done. So we're lifting that up. Abdul Shabazz is his name. He's a ward of the state of Delaware. Give it a look, see. And I want to stretch my hands out. Also, our dearly loved president lives in the state of Delaware. He's a former Delaware senator. One thing I like about Joe Biden, he's down to earth. And regardless of what people say, I think he's doing a great job. And I think that Kamala Harris is doing a great job. And so some of you naysayers are attacking Kamala. In the meantime, Joe is wise enough to put her out front on some of these issues, and that she's working very, very hard to deal with those issues. We have a crisis at the border, and Kamala Harris is on top of that, trying to get something done in the border. She's on top of this whole issue. We had the Supreme Court just ruled a couple of things in a negative way. One, they ruled out affirmative action, particularly in education. But there are some areas that doesn't touch. So spoke out on that particular issue. They also want to make it illegal to have an abortion, and that was ruled by the Supreme Court. So we have a man who is color, and so you can't depend on color. I think that Justice Thomas is probably one of the worst individuals that was ever placed on the bench. I think he's horrible. Anything that's pro-people, he's anti. And now I understand that he's living in a lap of luxury, getting gifts from other folks, breaking the law, breaking ethnic concerns, and he needs to resign. He's not going to resign. That man probably died sitting in the chair. I doubt very seriously if liberals or anyone who's calling for his resignation, you think that's going to work. It's not going to work. What we got to do is work to make sure we get someone in the presidential office who's making those appointments, and as appointments open up, put people in there who really care about people, who really care about this nation, who really care about democracy. And we are pro-democracy here. We are pro-democracy on this station. Some people call it capitalism, but I call it free enterprise. People should be able to develop businesses, to be able to take care of themselves, to be able to take care of others. And we should not have laws that transact against people, no matter whether they're black, white, or of any color. I want to thank you again for being here with us, for tuning in every week and seeing what we have to say on the Richard James Show. And we will continue to bring things in and tell the truth. That's where we are. We're going to tell it like it is. If you don't want to hear the truth, then you don't need to tune in. But God bless you and keep you, and may heaven smile upon you. This is your neighbor and your friend, Richard James, saying, till next week, we love you very much, and we look forward to seeing you again. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you again for tuning in to the Richard James Show. Our African and our African American programs are set up to educate you on what's going on in this world. And thank you for taking out the time to listen. Let us hear from you sometime also. So this is your neighbor and your friend signing off. Until I see you again next week and hear from you again next week. So long. God bless.